let's get right into another one of our excerpts from the Global Odyssey, this being excerpt 21 from Logbook 3, to understand the roots of discrimination against blacks. And I want to begin by talking about the exploding 1960s. Public coverage of discrimination by whites against blacks in North America exploded in the late 60s as the civil rights movement, with its sit-ins and boycotts, began to take hold in the United States. And when the freedom rides and the freedom marches began to occur in the southern U.S., they attracted participation by many Northerners, American and Canadian, including my outspoken minister, George Goth, of Metropolitan United Church in London, Ontario. In Canada, such protests were less widespread, but were present nevertheless. And the two major stories that captured national attention in Canada were the raising of a black community in Nova Scotia and the violence that flowed from a student protest at Sir George Williams University in Montreal. So let us begin to look at the Africville story, the life and death of a Canadian black community, and begin with a quote from a former resident, Eddie Carvery, who says, "Africville wasn't a hallucination. It was a real society within the larger society. And they poisoned us. They forced us out of our homes. They created illiteracy. They're guilty and they know it." So what is Eddie Carvery telling us about? The polite, somewhat unconscious racism against blacks in Canada, which outsiders often notice, is well reflected in the raising of Africville in the 60s. Africville was initially a small, unincorporated black community that eventually became part of Halifax through municipal amalgamation. It had begun following the American War of Independence with a promise by Britain to black loyalists of free land and equal rights in Canada. And for more on the story of the Black Loyalists, you could look at books like The Black Loyalists by James Walker and Black Loyalists by Ruth Holmes Whitehead. And of course, I hope you have read or will read Lawrence Hill's The Book of Negroes, including the later transmigration of these Black Loyalists to help establish Sierra Leone in West Africa. But Africville in the early 19th century was a small and poor but reasonably self-sufficient community of about 50 people. But starting in World War I, the community evolved to a more crowded and underserviced urban environment of about 400 by the middle of the 20th century. It was a depressed neighborhood. Its inhabitants had little education and very low income. Many were underemployed, and over the years, the city had placed in this area the garbage dump, a slaughterhouse, and other facilities unwanted elsewhere. The city had also withheld basic household services, such as running water, proper roads, street lamps, and only a handful of families in the community had been able to establish full legal title, while others had to just claim squatters' rights. Now, following World War II, federal, provincial, and municipal governments became enthusiastic about working to take communities that were labeled as slums and relocate the people to better housing while making key land available for business and industry. Having rendered the Africville area virtually uninhabitable, and buoyed by this new prevailing development notion of slum clearance for community development, authorities in Halifax appropriated the land in the early 60s and began to demolish the houses. Africville, in the minds of planning officials, was to become a focal point for extensive urban renewal and redevelopment under a new liberal welfare model. So to the general public, the relocation was presented as a progressive step. But to the people who were forced to move, the approach to their relocation was degrading. The city moved some of the people using city dump trucks. Much suspicion and jealousy emerged, mostly due to complications of land and ownership claims. Their cost of living in the new location went up. More people became unemployed, and most of the promised education and retraining programs were never set up. So this urban development model became another example of how top-down social planning, however well-intentioned, can sow the seeds for anger and protest. This story provided me with a powerful example of how misguided or misinformed social and economic development projects have the potential to dramatically increase rather than reduce social and economic inequalities. Designing successful models to support the advancement of new immigrants from different cultures, as well as multicultural groups already resident, became a topic of high interest to me in many of my later roles, particularly through my work in the International Development Research Center. And those of you who would like a comprehensive insight into these kind of issues globally today, I would like to suggest the book Arrival City by the Canadian Doug Saunders. Back to Africville, where initially Black leaders in Nova Scotia moved cautiously in challenging local authorities regarding the Africville project. Most inside the Black community had little awareness of how to organize to protect one's rights, and many Blacks outside the community were both embarrassed by Africville and timid about challenging the white authorities. In Nova Scotia, only a handful of Black people, most notably the Oliver family, had taken on the role of community leadership. Don Oliver, who had been one of our crossroaders in Africa, has now become a senator. And it was interesting that recent West Indian immigrants most often emerged as spokesperson for this Africville community. And Frances Henry, in her book, Forgotten Canadians, The Blacks of Nova Scotia, writes, "It is revealing of the level of oppression in the local community that leadership fell often upon those who were foreign-born and trained." That triggered in my mind that in the mid-60s, one of the sponsored students by the African Students Foundation from Sierra Leone wrote a letter to Maclean's magazine in which he said, and I quote, "I thank God that my ancestors left Halifax years ago to resettle in Sierra Leone, so I could grow up in a culture where my skin color was not viewed as a hindrance, rather than in Halifax, a community that would treat these Black families so badly." I understand the power of his feelings, but note that this, of course, writing predated the Blood Diamond Wars, which were to eventually tear apart Sierra Leone. But the raising of Africville became an ongoing source for stories aimed at raising awareness of racial challenges in Canada. Let's look at a few of these. In 1991, the National Film Board released a documentary film, Remember Africville. In 2006, Dundurn Press published a book, The Last Days in Africville by Dorothy Perkins. And Don Claremont and Dennis McGill published Africaville, The Life and Death of a Canadian Black Community. At the same time, Eastern Front Theatre produced a play by George Boyd called Consecrated Ground, and it also fictitiously chronicled the Africville convictions. In 2007, Heritage Canada funded an independent documentary called Stolen from Africville, written and directed by Canadian activist and performer Neil Donaldson and his co-writer Sohrab Deb. The story of Africville also had significant influence, I understand, on the work of the Black Canadian literary giant George Eliot Clarke. Several musicians wrote and performed songs whose roots were in the Africaville story. An African-Canadian singer-songwriter, Faith Nelson, released an album in 1986 called Africaville. Canadian jazz pianist Trevor McKenzie released the album No Thing Like a Chicken Wing in 1997 as a tribute to the neighborhood where he grew up. And in 2007, the Newfoundland hardcore metal band Bucket Truck released a video for their song Neighborhood by Neglect, which details the events surrounding Africville. And additionally, in 2007, the hip-hop group Black Union released a song, Maestro, about this historic little community. My dramatic introduction to one of the most serious musical efforts about Africaville came much later in 2008 in St. Lawrence Hall in Toronto. I was attending a special Black History event organized by a friend of mine, Michael Thompson, the now highly successful Jamaican-Canadian Toronto City Councillor. And this program was being carried out with Tourism Toronto. This social event included a powerful historical display on the role of Black Canadians in Toronto in the first half of the 20th century. The curator was Sheldon Taylor, whom I had heard of mainly because of the powerful exhibit on Black history he had mounted in 1993 at the prestigious Museum of Civilization in Hull, Quebec. But Sheldon and I had never met until that evening, and when we did, we found to our surprise that we had many connecting points. For example, one of his African relatives through marriage had been one of our early scholars in the African Student Foundation. His wife was the daughter of a former mayor of Nairobi, Kenya, and I had worked for several years with her sister in that city. Sheldon's early inspiration for his work had been influenced, he told me, greatly by an early visit and later extended work-study experience at the Cross Cultural Center. And he was surprised to find that I had been the creator of that center at Western University in 1968. So it was amazing that up till that time, Sheldon and I had not met till that night in Toronto. Joe Seeley, the Montreal-born Black jazz pianist, and his band was providing entertainment that evening. And thinking that I recognized the female singer, I spoke to them in one of their breaks during the evening and found out that she was Arlene Duncan, a Canadian singer-actress who was playing a role in the television hit Little Mosque on the Prairie that certainly was trying to tackle this challenge of cross-cultural relationship. And they were doing it with a touch of comedy. Joe Seeley and I spoke briefly of my interest in Black history, and he indicated that I might be interested then in their next selection they were planning to play. And so I heard for the first time selections from his Africville suite, of which I had been totally unaware. This suite consists of 12 pieces of music reflecting on places and activities in Africville where Seeley's father had been born. Seeley was working and living in Halifax during the time of the destruction of the community, and he began composing the suite in memory of his father. It became a Juno Award winner in 1997. In light of the controversy surrounding the community, the city of Halifax in the 1980s created Seaview Memorial Park on the site, preserving it from any future developments. Former Africville residents carried out protests at this site throughout the 1980s and 90s, and a recent book, The Hermit of Africville, detailed resident Eddie Carvery's 40-year protests on the grounds of Africville. And you can see a YouTube video about Eddie Carvey in Africville, Nova Scotia. In 2001, a United Nations report had called for reparations to be paid to the community of Africville. And in May 2005, Maureen MacDonald, NDP member of the provincial legislature, introduced a bill called the Africville Act, calling for a formal apology and establish of a development fund to support historical preservation and benefits of former residents and their descendants. Finally, in February of 2010, the Halifax Council ratified an Africville apology, which publicly was offered by Mayor Peter Kelly and included the following words: "We apologize for the heartache experienced at the loss of the Seaview United Baptist Church, the spiritual heart of the community, removed in the middle of the night. We acknowledge now the tremendous importance that church had, both for the congregation and the community as a whole. We realize words cannot undo what has been done, but we are profoundly sorry and apologize to all the former residents and their descendants." The Government of Canada eventually established an Africville Heritage Trust to design a museum and build a replica of the community church. The site has now been declared a National Historic Site, and a permanent exhibit about Africville is displayed in Nova Scotia's Black Cultural Centre in Preston. As recently as 2013, Noah Tavlin, a writer, artist, and production assistant at many TED conferences, prepared a short archival piece on Africville, which gave him an opportunity to release some of his personal anger at what had happened in that community. Tavlin writes, "Canada just loves to brag about how from 1840 to 1860, before the American Civil War, Nova Scotia was the last stop on the Underground Railroad. We even had national television propaganda showing us happy slaves popping out of furniture and finding a new life in the Great White North. But not everyone knows what a shitty time some former African American slaves and their descendants had on the East Coast. Not everyone knows about Africville." So the story of Africville continues to build its place in our history, hopefully to challenge us when we are too congratulatory about our lack of racism, but also hopefully to inspire us to keep taking actions aimed at creating harmonious, prosperous, and truly multicultural communities. So we turn our attention now to the infamous Sir George Williams riots. And for most white Canadians of my generation, the violent events at Sir George Williams University in 1968 were surprising, confusing, and depressing. Many in the white community struggled to make sense of it, to identify the cause, and many fell back on just blaming it on black radicals from the Caribbean. I remember, for example, the reaction of my close friend at the Ivy Business School, Al Michalachki. A graduate of Sir George Williams himself, Al was extremely proud of its community roots, which grew out of its original YMCA founding, and he was proud of its long-standing record in giving adults a second chance at education. Al, a noted professor of change management and organizational behavior at the Ivy School, was very emotional about the riots at Sir George. He was angry at the black students who, in his mind, were mainly to blame for the bad publicity this fine institution was facing. And so I wanted to know more about this unusual event. I had earlier heard mention of Roosevelt Douglas, the purported ringleader of the riots, and I've heard about him from several of my West Indian colleagues, but I knew nothing directly about the events except what I was starting to read in the press. Al Michalachki's passionate concerns heightened my desire to better understand what had happened. And here again I was to discover how the power of personal perception towards individuals of color and racial events in the United States would influence Canadian reactions. So what was the George Williams riot? If one Googles the story today, here's an extensive selection of what is offered there, and perhaps it's the simplest way of capturing the elements of a complex story. So let me read a lengthy quote from Google. In 1968, 6 black Caribbean students at Sir George Williams University, now part of Concordia University, Montreal, accused a biology lecturer of racism. They complained that the teacher was handing out failing grades to all his black students, regardless of the quality of their work. The students wanted the university to set up a committee to investigate the charges, and they demanded that the students themselves be represented on the committee. The university agreed to form the committee, but the students were unhappy with the representatives, believing that they would not get a fair hearing. And so they organized sit-ins and distributed leaflets publicizing their protests. When the committee's report dismissed the complaint of racism on January 29, 1969, all of the complainants, as well as about 200 other students, walked out of the hearings in protest and occupied the computer center in the Henry Hall building. An article in Saturday Night Magazine in 2000 wrote the following: "The occupation lasted 2 weeks, during which the students and the university bargained. The administration walked on eggshells. The students walked on air. The mood was festive. Passes were even granted to permit students to go home for showers before returning to the happening that was occurring in the building." Sir George had been added to the list of universities being mobilized by peace, love, and understanding. This happy sit-in continued until February 10th, when representatives from both sides appeared to have negotiated a settlement. The administration agreed to set up a new committee if the students would end the occupation. About 100 students were left in the building later that night when the whole agreement fell apart at the last minute. The protesters barricaded the stairwells, shut off the elevators and telephones. The university then turned the whole matter over to the police. Some protesters seemed to be keen to smash the university's mainframe computer. Douglas remembers this story, but his cooler head prevailed. And Roosevelt Douglas, that is, reports, "I really played the role of senior student activist," he says. Then on February 11th, fearing that we were about to be double-crossed in dealings with the administration, the students beefed up our barricades. The Montreal Police Riot Squad moved in. Someone lit a fire. The protest was suddenly transferred from peaceful sit-in to pandemonium. And when the police arrived on February 11th, the peaceful sit-in exploded into a full-scale student riot, the most violent in Canadian history. Protesters threw computers out the windows, wrecked property, set fires, destroyed student records. The police arrested 97 people, white as well as black. And on the following day, the accused biology teacher was reinstated, and the committee dropped the complaint of racism against him. So that's the summary of this story from Google. Douglas's interpretation later on was that a deal had been in place to form a committee to arbitrate the conflict when the police suddenly attacked. "We were totally betrayed," he said. "It was bedlam. In panic, the students began to throw out the computer cards and some small typewriters from the 9th floor. Other students started to demonstrate outside, some in solidarity, some others saying, 'Burn the niggers.' And as for the arson that caused $2 million in damage, Douglas says that someone other than the students, an RCMP agent provocateur or policeman, was responsible. Another theory suggests that the Black Panthers, seeking a cause célèbre north of the border, had orchestrated all this conflict. So now let's look at some of the legacy events to this Sir George affair. And let's look first at Rosie Douglas and his journey from revolutionary to prime minister. Roosevelt Rosie Douglas was labeled ringleader and served 16 months in prison. He was deported from Canada back to his homeland, Dominica, in 1975. This Sir George event was a long way away from Douglas's initial involvement in Canada when he studied agriculture at the University of Guelph with the intent of gaining experience to support his father's work back home. Following Guelph, however, he enrolled in political science at Sir George, which is how he came to be involved in the riots. It's interesting that Douglas was at one time the protege of former Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, who had personally organized his visa into Canada. And yet, by the end of the court case following the riots, Douglas was deemed a national security risk, imprisoned, then deported in leg irons and handcuffs. And following his release, this one-time protege of our Prime Minister started on a Marxist journey, moving from Cuba to Zimbabwe. And for the better part of a decade, he was based in Tripoli as an executive member of a Center to Resist Imperialism, racism, backwardness, and fascism. He received support for some time from the Libyan government to advise revolutionary movements in Africa. However, by 1985, he was back in Dominica, where he won a seat in Parliament, and persuading the local people to overcome their suspicions of his past activities. By 2000, he had become Prime Minister. Ironically, he returned to Canada in 2001, now as the Prime Minister of his country. And in that return visit, he reflected on the paranoid time of the 60s and how jittery Canadian authorities had been about Black power. He was insistent that the national security risk label placed on him was nonsense and just another example of the odd activities of the RCMP, which had by that time been well documented. I could resonate with this charge against the RCMP since in the 60s, I had experienced firsthand my own involvement with RCMP dirty tricks as a result of my work for the Dene Nation in their battle against the proposed Mackenzie Valley pipeline. And later, if you're interested, you will find this story in one of my excerpts from Logbook 8. Douglas's co-conspirator, Ann Cools, was originally from Barbados, and she had been sentenced to 4 months in prison after the riot. She was later pardoned, became an advocate for human rights, established one of the first shelters for abused women in Canada, and became the first Black woman appointed to the Canadian Senate. In a speech in Montreal upon his return to Canada, Douglas summed up Sir George affair with the word, "It was a fight for Black people to have an equal stake in the nation. We had no malice in our heads, we just wanted justice." As for the university, the riot forced the administration to think how they would deal with complaints of racism, and students finally became part of the university's decision-making process, and an ombudsman's office was created to hear student concerns. So what can we learn from the Sir George Williams University riot? Kevin Tungtang, a research fellow at the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva, provides us with a good summary insight into this question in an article on the Sir George Williams computer riots. And again, I quote, "Not many people would deny the existence of racism, but whenever complaints of racial injustices are made, the official reaction is too often one of surprise, incomprehensibility, and thus it tends to lean towards the position that such charges must by necessity have no validity. The persistence of such doubts on one hand, and the unwavering belief of those making the charges that they have been discriminated against on the other hand, have frequently combined to block communication, create stalemates, which in turn have led to the hardening of positions. Should positions assume features of rigidity, the danger of escalation then becomes imminent, and what might have begun as a localized incident may at the end become a national crisis. In a nutshell, this would represent a brief summation of the events that led to the racial explosion at Sir George Williams University in Montreal. And these events provided me with important learning as I continued on my evolving global odyssey which included a strong focus on the search for cross-cultural harmony. Let the journey continue.